Show podcast. Ryan Ray alongside the good doctor herself, Dr. Ellen Wald. Dr. Wald, I guess I should start off by saying for all the listeners, I was wrong. I said Putin wasn't going to invade. There it is. So I'm going to start there. I take my L before we get going. How are you doing today, ma'am?
I'm doing fine. I also did not think that Putin was going to invade, but apparently he has. Apparently there is a war. So all
Well,
that
okay,
entails.
so yeah, I was wrong, but I also was right last year when all my friends were telling me that China was going to take Taiwan and they didn't. So do I get the W for that, or do you get a W for all the time the warmongers say something's going to happen and doesn't? Because it feels like
Well,
if that's the case, then I'm
well,
up on the.
how long how long did this is this going on? Because just because China hasn't taken Taiwan yet doesn't mean
Right. Yeah. Someone's like, well, I think it's going to happen. I'm like, okay, well, when? They go, oh, well, the U.S. and China be in a hot war within the next decade. It's like, well, okay, hold on. The next decade, who knows what's going to happen? It's kind of, yes, that is possible in the next decade. Things could devolve because who knows what's going to happen next decade. So, anyways, but so if you haven't been following the news, obviously the Russians have done some sort of invasion into the Ukraine and are dropping bombs, and it is definitely hard to tell. Obviously, they've invaded, but it seems like the reports, at least this morning when I was online, was that there was a big thing of arguing about what's been going on, and I'm definitely not here to pretend that I have a grip of that. What I do know is since we got off the podcast last week, the invasion, I thought the first step was we're not going to keep the Russians off of Swift. And it's like, okay, so we're not really serious here. And then I think we're moving closer towards Swift, but it's not full Swift banning. And so then the Russians were like, hey, we're going to go to a one world currency. So that's been interesting to kind of watch that chess match go down.
Yeah, it's like everything that they said wasn't on the table is now suddenly on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember writing like over a month ago, I think. Yeah, I wrote something. I looked at this in January, and it was like, "There's absolutely no way that we would disconnect the Russians from SWIFT. This is not on the table. This is not being considered." And then Biden was like, "We are going to ensure that Russia cannot do business with the dollar." And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, well, how is he going to do that? Maybe he is talking about SWIFT. I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
raised the possibility, and like it was like, no, it's definitely not going to happen. Oh well, who knew? And now suddenly everyone's like talking about Swift, and you have like, well, but if the Swift is just a messaging,
Mm-hmm.
service, so it doesn't really do anything. And then people are like, oh no, yes it does. It's like, oh my god, suddenly like everybody knows about this.
Well, that, okay,
Remember that we disconnected Iran from Swift, and like you basically can't use credit cards there. Like you go to Iran, you got to take cash.
right. That's the thing.
Not that I'm recommending going to Iran.
Yes. But if you do go, take cash. Um, that is something that I've talked about for um, I don't know, a few years now. Is that this whole concept of how the powers that be, some of them operate as if we're back in the 1980s, 1970s, and 1960s. And so think about you saw this weekend or this past week protests break out in Russia and being streamed to the U.S. So during the Cold War, if there was protests going on, you might have heard about it, but they definitely weren't being shown on TV in the U.S. And so now you see, it makes you question, well, how strong is Putin? Well, that's not a question you really would have had during, especially the heat of the Cold War. And so the whole framework of like the Swift thing, yeah, in the 1960s, Swift, I don't know when Swift came around, but whenever it came around, people weren't on Twitter debating whether or not Swift was a thing or what you should do. And so I think it's hard for us to realize what kind of pressure that probably puts on the political leaders. But I think the political leaders are still trying to figure out, oh, how do we message stuff and then not get the pressure? Because as to your point, oh, well, Swift's on the table, and then all over the line, all online, blogs, posts, Bloomberg, everyone's crushing them for not doing Swift. Like, oh, wait, we're going to have to do Swift to be taken. And so I do think that public perceptions.
Yeah, and but this is the point. Like public opinion is not Twitter. Like Twitter is actually a really tiny fraction of the people. And I think that it gets blown out of proportion. Like just because it looks like everyone's clamoring for it on Twitter doesn't mean that like I just think these leaders, like, either they're all taking their cues from Twitter and everyone's jumping on bandwagons, like BP dumps Rosneft's share. Now Shell's getting out of the Sakhalin 2 LNG project. Like, like, are they doing it just to like one up each other for virtue signaling? Or do they think it's a good business move? Or are they getting actual pressure from the, um, from government? Or is it just like the Twitter mob? In which case, I'm sorry, people need to buck up. Like, the Twitter mob is not a real life mob.
It's not a real life mob, but it is composed of the right people, right? So all of the reporters are on there. All of them are sharing their articles. All of them are breaking news back and forth off of other tweets. And so if you're a government watching Twitter, you do get the impression that this is real life. Where I live, I'm sure if I went to the local cafe and started talking about the Swift network, not many people, if anyone, would care or know, right? And so,
Yeah, they'd
matter of
be
fact,
like,
I was at a
why
friend's
are my
house.
gasoline prices so high?
Right.
Or
I was
they'd
at
be like, awesome, gasoline prices are high. We love it
right.
here.
Yeah. So I was at a friend's house on Friday night, and one of the guys that was there is a business CEO of a multinational company. We're talking about it. He understood Swift, but some of the other people in the conversation weren't really up to snuff with what Swift was. And so it's kind of one of those things, like you're saying. Twitter is not real world, but it does represent an important, at least, perception of what the real world is from all the
Yeah.
media types that are on there.
Yeah, I just wish that people would realize that, like, that even if it does represent the media, like, they are not beholden to the media. Like, and I think it's the same phenomenon you see with everything else. It's like, with masks, with virtue signaling with ESG, with Black Lives Matter, with everything. It's like the same thing you see with every kind of like cause of the day, or whatever it is. It's like, quick, change your profile to this, share these videos that like may or may not be real,
Mm-hmm.
and tell people how to like donate to help poor Ukrainian slash whatever children, except of course none of this applies to like Afghanistan, right?
Right.
Like,
Well, yeah,
Afghani people are like starving, selling their kidneys for food, and like no one's like, I stand with Afghanistan.
or Yemen, because
Yeah,
the U.S. is in
because yeah. So,
or what is it?
but the
See here.
Ukrainians are white Christians, so
Let's see here. The U.S. is still bombing Somalia too, right?
probably
Yeah.
Syria.
Yeah. So that's the other point, though.
UAE is bombing Yemen. I mean, come on,
Right.
like,
It shapes a very narrow perspective of the conversation, but it is the right people that shape it. And that's the hard thing is, if the media starts talking about a certain topic from a certain perspective, it gets hard to get outside of that, especially with 280 characters, unless you're a
yeah.
red master.
I mean, this kind of brings up some of the articles that I picked for today, but I think it's an interesting question because you had, like leaders in the Ukraine calling for other countries to basically boycott Russian energy on Twitter. And then you have reporters asking like, oh, are energy sanctions on the table? And on Friday, we had Amos Hochstein, who said, he's like, no, they're not on the table. We don't think they'd be helpful. All it would do is push up oil prices. So even if Putin sells half as much oil, he'll still be making a lot of money, which I'm not sure I buy that as like the justification, but whatever, that's what he said. And you saw like WTI dropped like $7 on
Mm-hmm.
Friday.
Mm-hmm.
Then on Sunday morning, you get Jen Psaki, or however she pronounces her name, on like Good Morning America, and she's going on there and saying energy sanctions are on the table, along with a lot of other nonsensical things like we need more renewable energy because that will like make life better.
It's going to fix
Like,
the oil shortage.
yeah. I think I said something. I tweeted, like, what does she think that like we run on? Unicorn horns and pixie dust?
Yeah, exactly.
Someone
Exactly.
responded amusingly by saying, like, no, don't hunt more unicorns. But so then she said that, and I was like, oh, can't wait till the markets open in Asia because oil is going to go straight up now that she said that.
Mhm.
And it did. So, but the interesting thing is that are we going to be seeing basically like de facto, it's like a de facto kind of boycott, because it's clearly becoming more difficult to buy Russian oil. There were reports that some banks were not issuing letters of credit to traders who were trying to buy stuff because they were concerned about what the sanctions would be and whether they get paid. And that's understandable. There are ways to work around it, obviously. But now we're seeing like a Finnish refiner says that they have replaced most of their Russian crude oil purchases with other crudes like North Sea oil. This is due to crisis in Ukraine. So this is the interesting thing. They didn't explain like why. Like, are they doing it because they're concerned about availability or insurance costs or what? Because apparently Urals is trading like $10 below Brent right now. So it's clearly a good deal. Maybe the insurance costs, maybe the cost to insure cargo of it are so high that it doesn't matter. But so they didn't say whether it's because whether there's like a political or moral reason or it's a business decision. But then you have India saying that they're no longer going to accept cargoes of Russian crude oil and Kazakh CPC blend cargoes on a free onboard basis due to insurance risk. Let's see. This guy, a source at another state refiner, Bharat Petroleum Corporation, said his firm mostly buys Urals on delivered basis with freight and insurance included. So, but the source added that traders were not offering Russian barrels. So, India doesn't get that much from Russia and Kazakhstan to begin with, but it's interesting because they're actually like we're providing, a financial rationale for why they're not taking Russian crude or why they're not buying Russian crude, which does make sense. So it's kind of curious, and I wonder like how this is going to play out. Is this going to play out on a refiner by refiner basis, or are we going to see country by country action?
So yeah, you bring up a lot of good points there. And the other thing that I've been chewing on is how long does the fallout from this last? So let's say that by the time we record next week, the invasion's over, the Russians are back home. It feels like Putin has gifted the West, who has pounded, hey, Putin's, all the things they said about Putin for years. He's played into their hands. So if he has to do a retreat, he can't take Ukraine, and he has to go back home to Russia. I don't think the West is going to forget. Oh well, hey, you invaded this a few weeks ago. Let's go back to business as normal. It feels like some of these might have long and lasting sanctions because the threat of another invasion can be used against Putin. Do you think that will factor into all this? Because hey, you're doing business with someone who just invaded a country, or so that it feels like there should be a lot of lingering effects, but maybe not. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the U.S. did, put a lot of sanctions on Russia after 2014. In fact, ExxonMobil had to pay a big fine in 2018 because it signed some sort of deals with Igor Sashin, who was under sanctions. And Exxon argued that, like, no, it didn't think this was covered under sanctions. And OFAC was like, no, pay us. You're wrong. So, like, there was a lot of fallout that went on for many years over what happened in 2014 in Crimea. So I think that,
But this is
we can
worse.
expect, and this is even worse. I think that American companies were already less exposed because of that. Like Exxon only has like one joint venture left in Russia. It has some assets, it's been in since like 1985. And is allowed to continue. So, I think for the US, at least in terms of energy, it's not going to be as significant. But I do think that, it seems like for a lot of these European countries, this is a big shift. Or, I don't know, it's hard to say is something a big shift after like 3 days, right?
Well, okay,
You
so for
can't
years,
save it. It could
I
be.
mean,
I mean, does it have to end with Putin being removed from power? That's another big question. Like
okay,
that could
yeah.
be their condition.
So I've said it many
And
times on
does
the
that even
show
mean anything?
is that if the EU wants to be part of NATO, they're afraid of Russia. Okay, well now you have it. Now you have Russia has invaded the Ukraine. The EU, if they go back to buying from Russia, it's really hard to be sympathetic to that narrative at this point. And that's what I'm saying. Like all of those things, um, even though it's only been the invasion's only been whatever it's been a week or whatever it's been. It just feels like that's gonna be a hard messaging, right? Like, "Hey, Russia, you left. We're gonna go back to buying our energy from you."
Yeah.
Like, I mean, maybe, but God, like, it feels like it would be more likely that that Russia would have to go to, like, China or somewhere else to start selling, but I don't know.
Oh yeah, I that to me that seems really likely, and I think that that's something Russia's already prepared for. I mean, they've already negotiated new contracts with China. They're prepared to sell to China in yuan. I think China is even prepared to pay Russia in rubles. Yeah, I mean, I think that is one thing we're going to see. We're going to see Russia offering more oil to China at a discount, and I do think China will buy because why
Oh,
not,
wow. Yeah,
right?
so if you can get it at a discount, when with Brent sitting at $100 a barrel, then why would you not buy at a discount?
Right. And so then that begs the question, okay, so then does Saudi and Kuwaiti oil get rerouted to Europe?
So
Maybe,
what about
maybe
Venezuela?
not.
Like this is the time for Venezuela to rise to the
Yeah.
phoenix and to return to their old days of oil supremacy.
Oh, it's because we have oil sanctions on everyone.
But so you think about it, you got Iran and you got Venezuela. If things continue, I, I'll say it like this: if things continue with the Russians for months and months on end, we're gonna likely renegotiate, open up with Iran,
Oh
relook
yeah.
at Venezuela, right? At some point, because if oil prices continue to climb, and the Russians stay in the Ukraine for a couple months, both of those countries should be getting a call from the Biden administration.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Iran deal is like, I mean, it's interesting because a couple weeks ago I was on like a briefing for the Atlantic Council in Turkey with some people about Iran and what was going on. I was like the only like straight energy person. The other people were more like Iran people, and they were so positive about like the ability for a deal. Like they basically thought that like a deal was done, ready to be signed,
Wow.
whatever. And I was like, wow, the energy people are not this positive about it. I mean, it was, I think that, they have a lot of biases. These people have a lot of their own biases. And so you have to kind of read through that like they're extremely hopeful. You know what I mean? But I just thought it was interesting that there's definitely a dichotomy between people who are looking at the Iran situation from an energy perspective versus the people looking at it from more of a political perspective. I mean, it's almost March. A deal is not done. A deal could be done, and that could bring, as much as 1 million barrels a day back on the market from Iran within a couple months.
So
So that could
let
kind
me
of save the Biden administration's, it's not going to save the economy, but it might
right.
help.
Well, let me phrase it this way then. Iran and Venezuela, are they hoping that this Russian conflict lasts longer? You got the Biden administration on one side, but if China pushes forth with its digital yuan or some other kind of mechanism to start facilitating trade apart from
Mhm.
the U.S. control, would that be something that you might see that the Venezuelans and the Iranians are like, "Hey, yeah, Russia, keep doing your thing because we want this new system to kind of put pressure on the petrodollar."
I think this situation is only good news for Iran and for Venezuela because either it puts pressure on the US and the West to basically back down and reincorporate them, or it introduces basically like a shadow system that they've kind of been running on anyway. And it makes, if Russia's getting kind of ostracized by the West, then maybe the Russians, they're gonna, I mean, they're already invested in Venezuela. Maybe they're just gonna kind of you know, like how during the Cold War we had like the West and everything else. It's basically they're forming their own new like
Yeah.
system, and they'll operate within that, and it'll be kind of closed, not totally closed, but like very closed. And look, it's not the greatest. Like Russia, China, Venezuela, and Iran are not going to like produce the greatest things in the world, but the more countries come in, and Russia's not like the biggest economy. Like if you look at
No,
the
it's
Russian
tiny.
economy and you compare it to the US economy, like Russia is physically very large, but its economy is not so great.
Yeah.
And it mostly like exports agricultural products
Mhm.
and petroleum.
Yeah.
But you know, it's definitely a benefit to Iran to have more than just China to turn to, right? And same with
Mhm.
Venezuela. So I think Venezuela and Iran are in like a no lose situation here.
Mhm. Yeah, for perspective, the Russian GDP is 1.483 trillion. Texas is 2 trillion, and then Florida is of course it wouldn't pull up right there. I wanted it to, but I think
So
Florida's bigger as
so
well.
Texas has twice the GDP of Russia.
Yeah, yeah, the Russian economy is nothing.
Yeah.
That's
So
why
let's
that's part of the reason I've never been a big believer that they're gonna
yeah.
invade, because when you look at their economy, they don't have this mega economy. It's not like they don't have much, and so
But do they care? That's the thing. They don't care about human life. Like it's not, you
that's
know,
true.
like for us it's like, "Oh my god, is it worth the cost of human life?" Remember what happened in World War II? They just threw
Yeah,
they threw
more bodies.
soldiers at
Yeah,
the front. They threw
yeah,
them at the front, and they all died, and more people died in Russia than like any other country. And like, you know, so it's a different mindset.
okay,
I don't want to like criticize, you know, it's a different mindset.
sure. Okay, let's talk about OPEC Plus and the US frackers for just a second. We have to
Ooh.
get you on in less than 10 minutes. Okay, OPEC Plus. I mean, they're in a
Oh
weird spot
boy.
now, right? I mean, you
They're in
have
like the
Iran
weirdest.
sanctioned, you got Russia on the ropes. What are they
Not
gonna do?
only that, but guess who's on the Security Council at the UN right now? The UAE. Is that, you know how like
Oh,
how they're rotating members? The UAE is rotating on there was some sort
wow.
of vote the other day and they abstained.
Oh, speaking of the Security Council, I had this thought real quick just for our listeners. There was a recent debate about whether or not the U.S. Senate should keep the filibuster. Okay, so I got to think about that over this past weekend when
Okay.
Russia vetoed something last week. Um, until we get rid of the veto power for other nations in the UN,
Mm.
the filibuster has to stay in place, right? So if Russia can veto their own wars or whatever, then surely we should have the filibuster in the U.S. Senate. And that's not a Republican or Democrat thing. It's just tells you how nonsensical all this stuff is. But go ahead.
Oh,
OPEC Plus.
I personally think we should never get rid of the filibuster because this is so entertaining.
Oh,
It's
it's
like one of
hilarious.
the most entertaining parts of American politics, and it would just crush all entertainment value if you got rid of it. I mean, look, we don't even have that thing where they like stand up and they just like shout questions at the prime
Hmm.
minister, you know, in England where they're
Hmm.
like you can just like question the prime, and in Canada too where they're like just like we need that. I'm sorry. Like we really need that. I want the president to get like grilled by Congress people like they do in in those parliamentary systems. It's such a bummer that we don't. So if we're not going to have that, we definitely can't get rid of the filibuster.
Exactly. Okay. OPEC Plus. What are they
Sorry.
going to do?
That's just
No,
my
no, no,
2
no.
cents.
That was my squirrel. So
Yeah. Okay, OPEC plus. OPEC plus is in an interesting position because Russia is basically the glue that is the Declaration of Cooperation, right? Like Russia gets out of the Declaration of Cooperation, like who's left? Like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. I bet if Russia leaves, Kazakhstan leaves too, and then you've got like no production. So like Russia now, Russia's been Russia hasn't said anything about it. And we had the Saudi prince the other day saying, what was it that he said? He said, since the kingdom is still committed to OPEC plus oil agreement with Russia. That was the headline from Platts. Yeah, I thought this was good because so we had a call with the French president, um, and it was a little bit like it was basically like we affirm our commitment to market stability. But then I think they got a delegate from the Gulf that said all member countries are committed with the Declaration of Cooperation, basically saying like we're not changing anything. Now, OPEC has functioned even when members were like literally at war with each other. Like Iran and Iraq were at war for 10 years and OPEC
Mhm.
still functioned.
Mhm.
So it's not, there's this idea like oil policy kind of exists outside of geopolitical stuff, but it is a tricky situation because, like you said, there's a lot of pressure now, and people seem to care a lot more about Russia than people cared about the Iran Iraq war,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? So I think basically what I think is going to happen on Wednesday is I don't think they're going to change anything. I think they're just going to quick meeting, affirm their decision to increase production by 400,000 barrels a day. Production will obviously not increase that much because they can't.
Yeah, no one's hitting quotas though,
And
right?
yeah, well, Saudi
Oh,
Arabia is, UAE
okay.
is, I think Kuwait is, but like most people, a lot of them aren't. Russia, who knows? But I mean, it's in their best interest, like, to keep it mum. Like, do
Mhm.
not have a press conference. I mean, I would love to see a press conference, but I don't think it's happening.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
eh, I just think that, yeah. So I think, but it's a tough situation because, like, Russia really does hold it together. And there are, I would say, like, I think I used this term that I was like, my antenna are like up looking for signs. Like before I thought everything was like fine. Now I'm like, now that there are like real signs for boycotting stuff, and also because if there are signs that countries or refiners are just not buying Russian crude for whatever reasons they give, I think that, you know, that has the potential for maybe OPEC to consider that there is a real market issue coming down the
Okay.
line.
So let's transition here. I guess you'll be on here in just a few minutes. Let's transition here to the U.S. I mean, are we going to drill, baby, drill ever again? Are those days behind us? What's it going to take? I mean,
Oh my
I
God.
don't know. There's a headline the other day like $200 oil. The U.S. still won't drill. I have to believe. I don't believe that. I believe at some point that it's just too much money on the table, and we are capitalists somewhat in this country. So what's going
Yeah,
to
I
happen?
mean, look, if the current companies aren't going to drill, someone is going to say, "I can make money doing this, so I'm going to do it." You know what I mean? Just because like Occidental and Pioneer and Exxon aren't going to do it doesn't mean that nobody else will do it. But they might take longer.
I'm sorry, I cut out there. You said something about Oxy, and then
Oh, I just
my
said
connection was bad. Sorry.
just because Oxy and Pioneer and EOG or whatever aren't going to expand, if there's money to be made and there's the ability to make it, I think we'll see drilling. The question is the government going to make it more difficult? And when will it happen? Because, like, it's a lot easier for like an Oxy or Pioneer or Chesapeake or whatever to just expand drilling and get barrels on the market than it is for
Mhm.
like a new kind of startup.
Yeah. Well, I thought as we progress, we would see more consolidation in the Permian. But if they're not going to drill, the big companies are going to have problems expanding their drilling program. Then maybe you won't see that consolidation. I don't know. It feels it's just a weird time to see. I mean, production is going up, but it's a weird time just to see prices so high, and it just doesn't have the same old $100 oil is not what it used to be. I guess it's
Hey, inflation.
yeah, exactly. And so it's just it is definitely a weird time, and you know the Biden administration or Biden himself at least came out and was like, "Hey, we're gonna need more energy." Da da da. Oh, by the way, um, you know, we don't want you oil and gas companies to price gouge, so don't do that. And then it's like, oh well, that
Yeah.
didn't help. So,
Oh my God, that's so tone deaf. I'm sorry. That doesn't
okay,
help.
I think I see our guest in the green room there. If you can hear us, yeah,
Can I tell you
okay,
what my
yeah,
biggest pet peeve about this
all
whole
right.
thing is?
What's
Oh,
that?
okay.
Yeah, he's here. We bring him in. All right,
Oh, my biggest pet
Russell,
peeve
are you there?
is like
I'm here.
is
Can you
like
guys hear me?
why didn't we turn on the
Yeah,
Keystone XL pipeline?
exactly. Hey, Russell, how's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. Quite a week for energy news.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so Russell Gold, you are an author, a writer, all over the place. For folks who may not be familiar with your work, maybe a quick 30-second bio there.
Yeah, sure. I'm a writer right now at Texas Monthly. I cover energy and business. Spent 20 years from like 2000 to 2020 or so covering energy for the Wall Street Journal, and wrote a couple books, The Boom and Superpower, for them that's interested.
I've got some of those on that wall back over there. You probably can't see them though. Okay, so going into 2022, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely did you think it was going to be that you were going to write a story about the Texas Railroad Commission race in February?
Maybe a two. You know, and I
It
only
has
say
gone.
that because 2 years ago the Railroad Commission race got kind of interesting also. So nothing like we're seeing right now, but all of a sudden this sleepy little state office in Texas has gotten kind of interesting. So let's give it a two.
Okay, give it to. Okay, so let's maybe for folks who aren't in Texas or don't understand the Texas Railroad Commission, what it is, the race, what's at stake here, maybe kind of
Yeah,
unpack what the commission is, and then what's going on with the race and why you decided to write a story on it.
sure. So Texas Railroad Commission, it is a state office. The shorthand is that it's our elected oil and gas regulators in Texas. They also do gas utilities and pipelines, but they also do uranium mining. But basically, they're the oil and gas regulator here in Texas. We elect them, and they serve 6-year terms. And usually it's kind of a boring affair. The Republicans will put someone up, the Democrats will put someone up, and it really, Texas basically elects Republicans to statewide office. They have since the 1990s. So it's usually kind of a sleepy affair. This year, the Republican primary for Railroad Commission, to play off the name of the Railroad Commission, it's gone off the rails. It has just gotten all sorts of bizarre and interesting and tragic. I'm having trouble keeping track, and it all happens tomorrow. That's when we go to vote. Although we could have a runoff and still be having fun in a month.
Yeah, and so just real quick, Ellen, we'll chop in here just to make sure we're clear. The winner of the Republican side tomorrow is most likely, barring some miracle, going to be the next railroad commissioner, whether it's the incumbent or one of the challengers to Wayne Christensen's seat wins. They're got a 99% chance of winning in October if they win tomorrow.
Well, I don't know if I go 99%. Let's just say you have to go back to before George W. Bush was governor of Texas to find a Democrat that run statewide office here. There is a Democrat running uncontested, so he's just sort of coasting until the general. Smart young guy, Luke Wadford. So, he could certainly give it a go. It seems unlikely. I'm not sure I go 99%. Seems unlikely, but stranger things have happened.
Okay, fair enough.
So tell us a little bit about some of the candidates and some of the interesting things that you have uncovered.
All right. Well, first of all, you have to start with the incumbent. The incumbent's a guy named Wayne Christian, 71 years old. He's been in office for one term, so he's coming up on 6 years regulating oil and gas. Mostly what he's known for as a railroad commissioner is that he says he is going to, let me get the quote here, he has pledged not to bend the knee to extremist special interest groups who want to halt the production of oil and gas. So he's a former Tea Party member of the Texas House of Representatives. And, I've heard him rail against the press. I've heard him rail against renewables. He is, pro Texas oil and gas. Also noteworthy, in the 1970s, he was a member of a Grammy nominated gospel group. And I've gone onto YouTube. They were called the Singing Christians. I guess a play on Wayne Christian. I would recommend Calm the Storm for me. It's actually really good music. Whatever you want to say about him as a candidate or a railroad commissioner, he's a really great musician. I mean, it's good stuff. But basically, for the last 20 or 30 years, he's been a member of the Republican establishment here in Texas. And I think his slogan when he was in the House was "the only Christian in the House." So Not sure how that really worked in Texas, but fair enough.
So,
So
one of the things, real quick, one thing I've seen is a lot of talk about the flaring. That was kind of an issue, obviously, before COVID, and people were talking about it quite often.
yeah,
Is that really an issue you think that voters are concerned with, or is it just kind
I
of
haven't heard anyone talk about flaring. Are we flaring out in West Texas? I didn't know. No, the flaring has not been an issue that's getting any kind of anything. The big issue, and I'll use this to jump to some of the people running against him, is that you may remember a year ago we had this little blackout in Texas for about 4 days, and a lot of the reporting, I wrote about this. A lot of other people have. FERC and NERC have both written this. The problem was gas. A big problem was gas and gas pipelines, and the fact that a lot of our gas production just froze up, and that our gas power plants were basically just in time. And when you don't have gas flowing out of our oil and gas fields, then you don't have gas available to generate electricity. And so that's a matter for the Railroad Commission. They regulate gas utilities, they regulate pipelines, they regulate the gas producers. So that has become an issue. I would say that's probably one of the biggest issues right now in the Railroad Commission race. Dwayne Tipton, who's a former roughneck from Killeen, and who's running against Wayne Christian, he's picked up the endorsements of the big newspapers here in the state, the Dallas Morning News, Houston Chronicle. He talks a lot about the failure of the Railroad Commission to require the gas industry to weatherize and to be properly prepared for a very deep cold freeze like we saw in February 2021. And his quote that he gave to me is, "It is bull crap that we're a year in and there's been no major progress on winterization." So look, a lot of Texans, I think somewhere around, I should know this offhand, I think about 14 million Texans lost power at one point during the February storm last year. A lot of people remember it. He's building his race on that. Sort of say, Wayne Christian was part of the regulators. They failed. Time to be replaced. So that's Dwayne Tipton. He is probably the most, how should I put this? Just the most normal of the challengers, came out of the oil and gas field and is running. I would be surprised if he makes it into a runoff if he's not eliminated tomorrow, but that's why we vote. We got to find out. So then we have this guy named Tom Slocum. Tom is from Lubbock. He's an engineering consultant. He's kind of taking the right-wing Tea Party stance. He says, much like Wayne Christian, he says, look, I'm going to stop the liberal interest from destroying the oil and gas industry in Texas. Not quite sure how they're doing that, but make sure that the Biden administration doesn't come in and kill the oil and gas industry. He got a little notoriety, shall we say, when he put out on TikTok, I believe it was, might have been on Twitter. No, I think it was on TikTok, a campaign, ad or a social media post in which he shows off his gun collection, and he has a gold-plated assault rifle. He then picks up one of the guns, not the gold-plated rifle, and sort of shows everyone he's good at shooting, except he managed to mess that up. And I'm not I don't know how to fire guns, but he had to stop and redo it. And I can't understand why he didn't just reshoot the social media post, but he put that out there. And then that's Tom Slocum. And, he's been endorsed by the Amarillo newspaper, and, he's sort of trying to out right flank Wayne Christian. And we're only getting more interesting, so we're kind of wading into this slowly. It's like cold ocean water, you got to go in a bit at a time. We're up to our knees now. Then you got a guy named Sarge Summers who ran a kind of an oil field LinkedIn type connections. It was called Oil Field Connections, where you kind of find different people to work in the oil fields. He's most notable because, well, a couple of things. His wife had COVID, I believe in December or January, and he had a 40-day vigil outside her hospital room, praying for her. And then, I believe she pulled through, and he goes out on the campaign trail. And tragically, he died in a car accident, actually in an oil field related car accident, because he he was driving north of Midland and he hit a truck involved in oil field activity. There are a lot of roads out in the Permian Basin which are quite dangerous because they're just chock full of trucks and people driving very quickly. And he died in early February. He's still on the ballot because there wasn't enough time to take him off. And then we get to Sarah Stogner, who's maybe the most interesting of them all. Sarah Stogner, she's, I believe she's about 35, 36 years old, law degree from LSU. Although we don't hold that against her, having gone to law school in Louisiana, practice corporate, some corporate law, is now out on her own. And she, she's been very involved in this very interesting case out in West Texas involving oil field damage to a ranch, to some land owner's property, and decided, got frustrated with the Railroad Commission, didn't think they were doing enough to protect landowners and Texas, so got into the race. And she sort of got all of our attention on Super Bowl Sunday when she released a video on TikTok and Twitter of her astride a pump jack, less than fully clothed. I mean, she's wearing pasties and I believe underwear, or maybe some short pants, but it's quite racy, kind of NSFW, and has gotten a lot of attention for it. So that's it. That's the race, It's, and this is what I find amazing about this. This is the Railroad Commission. There was a time not 50 years ago when the Railroad Commission was probably one of the most important global financial institutions. It set the price of oil in the 1950s. And then, this is a life or death issue. If our gas isn't flowing, people died in the Great Freeze and the blackouts a year ago. And somehow we have this race on our hands for Railroad Commission where it's just, it just gets more and more odd and more interesting the deeper into it you go.
So I have a couple questions. So the first question is Texas a state that has like open primaries? So can anyone vote, or do you have to be a registered Republican?
It's open primary. If you show up, you just declare yourself a Democrat or Republican, and you can vote in that primary.
Okay. So, and is there any expected any numbers on expected turnout?
So all we know is there's a period of early voting here in Texas. Early voting has been a little light. Not that surprising for an off-year election. There's really not a lot of contested races out there. Our attorney general race is kind of interesting, but not that many people are going out and vote. So it looks light, which basically means who knows what's going to happen, and if no one gets 50%, we're going to have a runoff.
Right. So on that, one of the things that Sarah said was that she wanted to get attention and all this stuff, but it felt like when Ryan Sitton lost, he lost and the other guy got no attention and kind of snuck in and beat him. At least that's how it felt in real time when it happened. So do you really need the attention of the media to win the Railroad Commissioner race?
No, I don't think you need not just do you not need the attention of the media, but there's just not, I've been a reporter in Texas for 25 years, and I've just watched the impact and influence of the media wane over those years. Yeah, the reason I'm wondering whether Sarah Stogner might be kind of brilliant is that, this is going to be a low turnout race. Few people are going to go and vote. Of those people who vote, maybe they check for governor and lieutenant governor, but do they really get down to the Railroad Commission? Is she going to inspire a lot of people to come out and vote? I don't know. We'll see. I mean, this is kind of a fascinating attempt to win an election. And I will say, I actually know Sarah Stogner. I've reported on, things she's worked on for the last, many months. She's a serious candidate. She is a very serious person, and, she stripped down to get attention, but I don't see any reason why she wouldn't be a perfectly good railroad commissioner.
I'm gonna ask one follow up before I let Ryan share his thoughts on Sarah. Do you think that if she is successful, even if she doesn't win, but maybe gets enough to get into some sort of runoff, what does this say potentially for? I believe Beto O'Rourke is running for governor, right?
Yeah.
What does this say potentially about the kinds of tactics that maybe he should be pursuing in order to increase his chances?
I mean, yeah, that's.
I asked this with a straight face, but if you,
Well,
but,
you know, there's actually. Let me kind of take a half serious swipe at answering that question. You know, if you remember a couple of years ago when Beto O'Rourke ran against Ted Cruz in the Senate and came very close, came within 2 or 3 points of defeating him, one of the reasons he got a lot of attention was that he was kind of unlike any politician we had seen for a while, right? He would curse. You know, he would get up and just say whatever. He wasn't polished. You know, he was very smart, but I mean, I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, is Texas ready for a politician who gets up on the stump and curses? You know, no, they weren't, but he did pretty well. They, you know, did better than any Democrat I can recall in years. So I just wonder whether after 2+ decades of single party rule in Texas, whether someone using unusual tactics, unconventional, unorthodox tactics might be the way to break through. And, you know, if she does, yeah, Beto, take off your shirt, see what happens, you know?
No, Beto, no,
well,
please.
remember Wendy Davis? She got a lot of attention just for wearing sneakers.
She got a lot of attention, right? You remember she was the one who stood up and did the filibuster against God, I don't even remember. So many sort of
abortion.
It was definitely something abortion related. And I wish I should know, but there's been so much activity in Texas legislating abortion in the last few years. It's hard to remember. She was a lackluster candidate. Great start, and then kind of fizzled from there. You know, maybe that's what's going to happen to Sarah Stogner. You know, gets a lot of attention right at the get-go and then fizzles out. You know, the other question I think for Sarah Stogner is that once you kind of establish your political brand, it's hard to really change that. So, you know, she's just always going to be known as the candidate who you know, appear topless in an ad. I mean, you know, she could be, you know, she could have the best ideas and it might be hard to break free from that. So I don't know where she goes from here.
Yeah. So just for reference for the listeners, I did know Sarge and I do know Sarah as well. So I should probably disclose that in the comments. Don't know them. Did not know Sarge very well and do not know Sarah very well either, but I do know them. And so I think
Sarah once retweeted one of my tweets.
All right.
About my
but no, I mean, I've had Sarah. We had Sarah on the Texas One Guest podcast. We had her at an event one time years ago, and so and Sarge, you know, when you talk about the power outage, you know, Sarge and I were DMing like at 4:00 in the morning because we were both freezing in our houses, and we both had to be on Twitter or something, and so we were DMing back when his wife did pass away. Actually, his wife
she did. Okay, I was trying to remember.
He got remarried, I think, is what had happened there. But you know, so for me, the thing is, I don't look at the Railroad Commission with a lot of respect for how they handle some issues. And the hard part is you look at how the race has been, and Wayne hasn't really seemed to take the candidates seriously, but then the candidates haven't really seemed to be always serious enough to maybe deserve his respect. And that's kind of been the balance, it seems. And so what would you say to that?
You know, it's interesting because this race doesn't take place. There are no debates. There's no polling. You know, no one's doing a horse race. There's really not a lot of back and forth between the candidates. The real struggle is to try to capture attention. You know, Wayne Christian, he's got name recognition. He's got political backing from a lot of Republican groups. So, you know, my sense is he's just kind of put it on cruise control and just figured he'll be able to. He doesn't want to get kind of in the trenches with these guys because that will benefit them. You know, he can kind of take the high road and just cruise to re-election. You know, I don't know. I mean, I guess in some ways I give the most respect to someone like a Dwayne Tipton who's sitting there talking about, you know, the issues, right? This is the biggest issue that faced the Railroad Commission in the last, you know, 12 months clearly has been gas and gas regulation. They are completely involved in that. We can get more into that if you want. And he's talking about it. I don't hear Wayne Christian talking about that and defending, defending his record really on what happened in the blackouts.
Yeah, well, the thing I think that we've that I've talked about when I was on Texas Guest podcast for so long is that the regulatory body should be primarily defending the rights of the landowners or the mineral owners, and you don't really get that's the case that's there. And so when you go to the Texas freeze, also the thing that I thought was troubling is that there was no, there's no guarantee of service, right? So you're signing up to get this heating, and there's no one actually there to guarantee that you do it, and then there's no recourse because they can't guarantee it. And that's, again, I am the podcast listeners, I'm not a big regulation guy, but there's problems fundamentally that structure, which is, hey, I'm paying you for a service, but then you don't have to guarantee it to me, but then you there's no way to stop that, and then it's a very complex problem that feels like it needs to be resolved, but the Railroad Commission has failed to do that. And so I'm not very sympathetic to the current leaders. I'm not sure if there's a candidate that's actually going to get in there and change it. And that's the other thing is it's a 3-seat office,
right?
With Sitton going out, and I can't remember the guy's name. Wright, I think, who replaced
Jim
him.
Wright.
Yeah, Jim Wright replaced him. How big of a shakeup would it be to kind of get another a second first-term candidate on there, and you'd only have left is Craddock.
Christy Craddock.
Christy Craddock. Yeah. It really depends who. If someone like Sarah Stogner gets on there, the Railroad Commission, their monthly meetings is going to become must-see viewing. And I'm being really serious. Right? Can you imagine Sarah Stogner and Christy Craddock kind of going after each other from the dais? Arguing about this and that. People would be paying attention, and people would be paying attention to the Railroad Commission in ways that they haven't for years, for decades. You mentioned before the purpose of the Railroad Commission is to protect the mineral right, the interest of the landowner and the mineral rights owner. I have never seen that. To me, the Railroad Commission has always been about promoting the interests of the oil and gas industry in Texas.
No. What I'm saying is that if you're going to have an entity like Railroad Commission, they should be primarily focused on protecting the people of this, their constituents, not the. So I'm a free market guy, but if you're going to have regulatory, then we need to protect the people that you're impacting. That's part of what Sarah's crusade has been on, is that you have all this stuff going on, and who's there to protect that person? Well, no one. It seems.
It's a great question. I mean, I remember back in the 1997, when I was a baby kid reporter for the San Antonio Express News, meeting with the folks from the King Ranch, this giant cattle ranch down in South Texas, and they were complaining about abandoned wells, and they couldn't get the Railroad Commission, to come take them seriously. And, think about that. This is one of the most powerful, storied institutions in the state of Texas, and they were complaining that they couldn't get the Railroad Commission to take them seriously. What hope then does, someone who owns 20, 30 acres, and is having a problem with a pipeline? There really is no recourse at this point.
I'd like to see. I mean, I remember we actually had Christy Craddock come on this podcast to talk to us. I think it was when oil prices went negative, and there was talk that the Railroad Commission might actually do prorationing. And she came on before that, and I remember actually watching. That was the first time I watched that whole prorationing meeting, and I was interested mostly as a historian because I've written about the Texas Railroad Commission during the Depression and the New Deal.
Right.
I think my favorite thing that happened at that meeting was when the three commissioners, it was obviously all, done separately and distance and whatnot, but they're like, well, does anyone remember how we do this? They were asking the people, like they were even asking the oil company executives. They're like, well, the last time we did this was, the 70s. Right. Does anyone remember how we did that? And I'm thinking to myself, oh boy, I feel like they're really entering maybe
the ironic thing is that the story is that Venezuela and Iran learned how to do OPEC style, cartel behavior from the Railroad Commission, right? How to limit. And so maybe what the Texas Railroad Commission needed to have done is gone to Venezuela and Iran and say, hey, we taught you back in the 50s. We need, teach us, do us a solid and return us the favor. What are we supposed to be doing?
Yeah. Well, what was his name? Juan. Perez Alfonso, he like basically like hung out in Texas, like reading their records and
Right.
came up with the idea for it. And yeah, I wouldn't it be funny if Christy Craddock and Wayne Christensen and whoever Wayne Christian and whoever end up they show up at the OPEC secretariat saying, can we just observe your meeting just so we know how to do this.
But we're sitting here, and this is funny, and I'm 100% with you guys. This is crazy, but if you sort of look at what's going on in the world right now, and the sort of question about like, all right, so with growing tensions with Russia, how should the United States respond? How should Texas respond to it? Do we increase output? Are we afraid if we increase output too much, we'll end up crashing prices? These are really important questions. And I don't see the current Railroad Commission, the 3 members, grappling with these questions. Now, granted, you could say it's too early. We just, last week was the invasion of Ukraine. I hope it was last week. Yeah, last week. But, can you imagine Christy Craddock, Jim Wright, and Wayne Christian sitting around trying to figure out like how to best protect and promote, national security and Texas industrial oil and gas development, based on these sort of complex geopolitical forces right now? It's hard to imagine.
Yeah. And that's kind of what I was asking earlier about the flaring question, because when the race was kind of starting, people were still kind of talking about flaring. And I was like, that's not really an issue. Obviously, you have the freeze as an issue, but it's really interesting because what the issues are have kind of shifted as the race is developed because of what's going on in the world. And so the lack of a formal debate would have been this bonkers, but the lack of formal debates has kind of hindered better understanding what the candidates have done. Okay, I know.
And one other point, though, just to, so put yourself in the position of a Texas voter who doesn't follow energy, and they go into, the booth and they're like, okay, so, Greg Abbott, do I want Greg Abbott, or do I want West, or do I want Huffines? Who do I want in the Republican primary? And then you get down to the Railroad Commission, and most people probably saying themselves, railroads, what Amtrak, so
Right.
The very fact that we have not renamed this the Texas Energy Resources Commission or whatever it is, just makes it that much harder to really, for most people to even understand what they do.
Yeah. Okay. Where can people find you? Do you have any more book projects you're working on? Anything like that? Do you want to plug or promote?
Yeah, no book projects right now. I'm at Russell Gold on Twitter. Hard at work on a frontline documentary about energy and climate that will be coming out in the next few months. I'm consulting on that, and that should be interesting. I've seen some rough cuts. So other than that, just get a subscription, follow Texas Monthly, and we're writing about all this stuff. Just had an article come out about Texas LNG with Ukraine and Europe. So we're following and writing about it. If it's happening in Texas, we're gonna keep an eye on it.
Okay, well, look forward to getting you back on, hopefully after your documentary comes out to discuss that as well.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, Dr. Wald. Let's see here. That was fun.
Yeah.
And the race is crazy. It is absolutely crazy. So
I wish I was voting in Texas, because that would be interesting. We had a very subdued city council race in Jacksonville, where the biggest issue is, when are they going to collect our recycling?
Yeah, that's what's on my mind daily. When is the recycling getting picked up? I will say this: I am curious to see if Abbott gets through the primary without having to run, a runoff. And so I don't know if I haven't looked at the polling or stuff, but Huffins has put up a ton of billboards all over the state. So I'm curious if that will pay off for him or not. I guess we'll know here before too long. And with that, Dr. Wald, where will you be this week?
Let's see. Where will I be this week? Well, I was on the radio in Los Angeles earlier today, which was super fun, talking about oil prices and all of that. I should be on investing.com later this week. And I was on the Hill last week. Not the actual Hill, like I had a piece come out on the Hill. And, we'll see. There's no PEC meeting on Wednesday, so I will be paying attention to that. So follow me on Twitter for the latest updates.
Okay. Inside the War Room had several podcasts that have been in the hopper. Dr. Jeremy Friedman that Ellen and I did, and a few others came out. So be sure to check those out. And I think that's it for me. With that, we'll be back next week.